It was just another evening, or so I thought. I had just come home from a long day at work, exhausted but glad to be back in what I thought was my sanctuary. Dinner was on the table, and we went through our usual routine: small talk about our day, a few chuckles over something trivial. On the surface, everything seemed fine. But that night, things would take a turn I never expected. As we sat down after dinner, I felt it, the distance between us. It wasn't new, but I had always dismissed it as life getting in the way. After all, we'd been married for years. Things cool off, right? But this wasn't just a lack of spark. This was a void, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. So, I decided to try and bridge the gap. I leaned in, initiating intimacy, hoping that tonight we could reconnect. That's when she said it. "If you want intimacy, then pay." I froze, completely caught off guard. My first thought was that it had to be a joke. Maybe she was being sarcastic, trying to tease me in some bizarre way. So, I chuckled nervously and asked, "What's that supposed to mean?" But her face was dead serious. She wasn't joking. "You heard me," she said, crossing her arms, and leaning back like this was the most reasonable thing in the world. "If you want to be close to me, it's going to cost you." For a moment, I just sat there, trying to process what was happening. The woman I had vowed to love, honor, and cherish for the rest of my life had just put a price tag on our relationship. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Was this some sort of new way of asking for more financial support? Was she angry about something I had missed? The room suddenly felt suffocating. "What are you talking about?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaky but firm. "We're married. This isn't some transaction." She shrugged. "Well, maybe it should be. You expect so much from me. Emotional support, physical connection, everything. And yet what do I get in return? You want intimacy? Then I want to be compensated." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. Compensated for what? For being my wife? For being in a partnership we both agreed to? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My thoughts were racing, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, confusion, and hurt. I asked her point blank if this was about money. Had I failed her financially? Were there debts or expenses she was hiding from me? But she dismissed that idea with a wave of her hand. "It's not about money," she said, though the irony of her statement wasn't lost on me. "It's about what I deserve." I couldn't help but feel disgusted. "Deserve what?" I asked. "What about what I deserve? I've worked tirelessly to provide for us, to ensure we had a stable life. Wasn't that part of the deal when we got married?" I had never treated her like she owed me anything, so why was she treating me like some customer in a business transaction? The conversation escalated quickly. I told her how hurtful her words were, how degrading it felt to have my role as her husband reduced to something so cold and transactional. But she didn't back down. If anything, she doubled down. She told me that if I couldn't see things her way, maybe I wasn't the partner she needed. Even more upset, I left the room. I couldn't sit there and continue arguing about something so absurd, so fundamentally wrong. My head was spinning. Was this what our marriage had come to? Had I missed the signs along the way? Or was this some new version of her I was just meeting for the first time? As I sat alone in the living room that night, replaying the conversation over and over in my head, I realized this wasn't just a bad argument or a misunderstanding. This was a shift, an irreversible crack in the foundation of our marriage. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. I spent the rest of that night on the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece it all together. The silence in the house felt louder than ever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I thought I knew about my marriage had been upended. This wasn't a passing argument or a bad day. It was something much deeper. But what? Where had this even come from? I needed answers. The next morning, I approached her cautiously, hoping that with some time to cool off, she'd be willing to explain herself. Over coffee, I asked, "Can we talk about last night? I don't understand where all of this is coming from." My voice was steady, but inside, I was bracing myself for anything. She didn't even look up from her phone. "What's there to talk about?" she said, her tone dismissive. "I told you how I feel." That spark of frustration ignited in me, but I bit my tongue. If I was going to get to the bottom of this, I couldn't let my emotions take over. "I'm not trying to argue," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "But you can't just drop something like that and expect me to move on as if nothing happened. Why now? Why would you even say something like that?" Finally, She looked at me, her expression a mix of annoyance and indifference. Because it's the truth, she said, her voice flat. You want me to pretend like everything's fine when I feel like I'm doing all the work in this relationship. I'm the one who keeps this house running, who makes sure everything's in order, and what do I get in return? Barely anything. Her words stung, but more than that, they confused me. You think I don't contribute? I asked, my voice rising slightly despite my effort to stay calm. I work long hours to make sure we're comfortable. Everything I do is for us. She shook her head. That's exactly it, she said. You think working and bringing in money is enough, but it's not. There's more to a marriage than that. I felt blindsided. Where was this coming from? Sure, things hadn't been perfect. We'd had our share of disagreements and rough patches, but I'd always believed we were in this together. Now it felt like I was being put on trial for crimes I didn't even know I'd committed. The rest of the day, her words lingered in my mind. I started replaying moments from the past year, trying to find clues I might have missed. Were there signs that she felt this way? I thought back to her complaints about being overwhelmed and how she'd started spending more time out with friends or engrossed in her phone. I chalked it up to stress or her needing some space. Had I been blind to something bigger? I also began to wonder if this was about more than just our relationship. Was she struggling with something she hadn't told me about? Financial stress, perhaps? I tried to think of any recent expenses that might have pushed her to this breaking point, but nothing stood out. Bills were paid on time, and while we weren't swimming in money, we weren't struggling either. That evening, I decided to confront her again, this time with a different approach. I've been thinking about what you said. I began cautiously. And if you feel like something's missing, we should work on it. But I need to know, what do you think I'm not giving you? Her response caught me off guard. Respect, she said flatly. You don't respect my time or my effort. You think you can just come home and expect everything to be ready for you, and I'm supposed to be okay with that. I was floored. Respect? I had always tried to show her how much I appreciated her. I thanked her for what she did and made sure she knew I valued her. At least I thought I had. Was she right? Had I taken her for granted without realizing it? Or is this just her way of shifting the blame? The conversation ended there, with neither of us willing or able to push further. That night, as I lay awake on the couch again, the question swirled in my mind. Was this really about respect? Was it something I could fix? Or had we both been pretending for far too long that things were fine when they weren't? Whatever the reason, one thing was clear. This wasn't going to blow over. Something fundamental had changed between us, and I wasn't sure if it could ever be repaired. But I knew I had to try to understand, even if every answer only seemed to lead to more questions. By the time another sleepless night rolled around, I had reached my breaking point. The conversations with her went nowhere, always circling the same arguments without ever landing on anything concrete. She felt unappreciated, I felt blindsided. But one thing was clear, her idea of putting a price on intimacy had crossed a line. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just insulting, it was a complete betrayal of what marriage was supposed to be. And if she expected me to play along with this new set of rules, she was in for a rude awakening. The next morning, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to engage in her game. Whatever she meant by compensation or respect, it wasn't going to come in the form of me literally paying for affection. I decided I had to make that crystal clear, even if it led to more tension. After breakfast, as she sat scrolling through her phone, I stood in the doorway and said, "We need to talk." My tone must have caught her attention because she finally looked up. Her expression was blank but guarded. "Listen," I started, trying to keep my composure. "I've thought about what you said about paying for intimacy, about how you feel like you're not getting what you deserve, and I've decided I can't do that. I won't." Her face didn't change. She just stared at me, waiting for me to continue. "This isn't how a marriage works," I said firmly. "I'm your husband, not your customer. If there's a problem between us, we should fix it together. But putting a price on this? That's not the answer. I won't fund this circus." The last line slipped out before I could think better of it, and I could see the flicker of anger in her eyes, but I didn't back down. "Oh, so now I'm running a circus?" She shot back, her voice icy. "You're so quick to judge, but you don't even see your own part in this." I sighed, already feeling the conversation spiraling. "I'm not saying I've been perfect. I replied, trying to steer things back. But this changes everything. If you feel like something's missing, we need to talk about it, not put a dollar sign on it. Her arms crossed, and she leaned back in her chair. You just don't get it, do you? You think this is about money, but it's not. It's about me finally taking control of what I'm worth. That line stuck with me, but not in the way she probably intended. Taking control of what? Of me? Of our marriage? The more she spoke, the more it felt like she was rewriting the rules without even consulting me. It wasn't just hurtful, it was manipulative. I get that you're frustrated, I said, my voice firmer now. But this approach, it's not going to work. I'm not going to pay for something that should be built on love and mutual respect. If that's not enough for you, then maybe we have bigger problems than I thought. Her response was immediate and sharp. Oh, damn right we do, she said, standing up and walking out of the room. I watched her go, feeling a mix of anger and sadness that I couldn't quite shake. The days that followed were a blur of cold shoulders and clipped conversations. It was like we were living in two completely separate worlds under the same roof. She wouldn't back down from her position, and I refused to compromise mine. It was a stalemate, and the tension was unbearable. But even through all of that, I felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't questioning myself. I knew where I stood, and I wasn't going to budge. If she wanted to test me, fine. But I wasn't going to let her turn our marriage into some kind of transactional agreement. It wasn't just about the money or the intimacy anymore. It was about principle, about what I was willing to accept and what I wasn't. And as the days turned into weeks, that line I had drawn in the sand became the only thing keeping me grounded in an increasingly chaotic situation. The house became a battlefield, not with shouting or dramatic fights. Those at least would have been cathartic. No, this was something quieter, colder, and somehow worse. The silence that filled the rooms wasn't just empty. It was loaded, brimming with tension so thick it felt like I was breathing it in. Every word exchanged between us was clipped, sterile, as if we were strangers forced to share a space rather than two people who had once promised each other forever. She barely spoke to me unless it was necessary, and when she did, her tone was sharp and dismissive. It wasn't like I was trying to make small talk either. Most days, I avoided her altogether. What was the point? Every time I tried to approach her, even for something mundane, it ended the same way, with her rolling her eyes or finding some passive-aggressive way to remind me of her worth. One evening, I came home to find her shopping bags scattered across the kitchen counter. Luxury brands, designer names I didn't recognize, half the logos unfamiliar. But I didn't need to know the specifics. My bank account would certainly recognize them. As I stood there staring at the haul, she walked in, completely unfazed by my presence. She didn't even bother to explain. What's all this? I asked, keeping my voice steady. What does it look like? She replied without looking up from her phone. It looks expensive, I said, frustration creeping into my tone despite my effort to stay calm. We talked about being smart with money, didn't we? She finally looked up, her expression smug. Oh, don't worry, she said, waving her hand dismissively. It's nothing compared to what you'll need to spend if you actually want my attention. It was a punch to the gut. There was again, this twisted new version of her, weaponizing intimacy and making a mockery of everything I thought our relationship stood for. I stood there stunned as she brushed past me, leaving her shopping bags on the counter like some trophy of her newfound power. The days following that incident were no better. Her attitude hardened, and she started using the silent treatment as a weapon. If I didn't cave to her demands, she'd find new ways to push me. She'd deliberately ignore me when I spoke, go out without telling me where she was going, and flaunt her independence in ways that felt more like provocation than empowerment. The worst part wasn't the fights or the silence. It was the way she seemed to relish the control. Every interaction felt like she was testing me, waiting for me to crack. But I didn't. I couldn't. Giving in meant losing something I wasn't willing to lose, my self-respect. One night, I came home late after staying at the office just to avoid going home. The house was dark, and I thought maybe she'd gone to bed. But as I walked into the living room, I saw her sitting there on the couch, scrolling through her phone, a glass of wine in her hand. She didn't look up. Late night? She asked, her voice dripping with disinterest. Yeah, I said, not bothering to elaborate. Work? She allowed a short laugh, one that wasn't meant to be kind. Work, right, because that's where all your time and energy goes these days. I felt the jab, but I didn't bite. What do you want me to say? I asked, exhausted. That I'm avoiding this house? Because I am. It's miserable here. She finally looked up, her eyes narrowing. You think I'm miserable? You're the one who refuses to step up. You think I'm not stepping up? I said, my voice rising despite myself. I've done everything I can to make this work, and all you've done is tear it down. You're the one who brought money into this. You're the one treating our marriage like some kind of business deal. She stood up, her wine glass still in hand, and took a step closer. And you're the one who's refused to meet me halfway. So congratulations. You're getting exactly what you deserve. I stared at her, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, and felt a surge of emotions I couldn't even begin to name. Anger, sadness, resentment, but most of all, disappointment. Not just in her, but in us, what we had become. That night, as I lay in the guest room I had unofficially claimed as my own, I realized we were no longer fighting for each other. We were fighting against each other. And at that point, I wasn't sure there was anything left to save. After weeks of living in a house that felt more like a war zone, something inside me snapped. I woke up one morning in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, and realized I couldn't live like this anymore. I wasn't even sure who I was anymore, tiptoeing around my own home, constantly walking on eggshells, trying to avoid her cold glares and cutting remarks. This wasn't a marriage, it was a standoff, and I was done being a participant in her game. That day, I made a decision. I needed to take control of my life. If she was going to treat me like an opponent instead of a partner, then I had to start prioritizing myself. I wasn't sure what that meant exactly, but I knew I couldn't keep circling the same drain, hoping for some miraculous change that clearly wasn't coming. The first thing I did was step back emotionally, mentally, and even physically. I stopped trying to fix things. I stopped initiating conversations that always turned into arguments. Instead, I focused on myself. After work, I went to the gym for the first time in years. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in ages because I'd been so wrapped up in trying to keep my marriage afloat. I even started reading again, something I used to love but had long since abandoned. It was liberating, but it also brought clarity. The more I focused on myself, the more I started to see things for what they really were. I'd spent so much time trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong or how I could make her happy, but the truth was glaring me in the face. Her happiness wasn't my responsibility. A partnership is supposed to be mutual, a two-way street. But our marriage had become a one-sided transaction, and I was the one footing the bill emotionally, financially, and otherwise. One evening, I came home after a particularly long day and found her sitting in the living room watching TV like nothing was wrong. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was just tired. Tired of pretending this was fixable. I think we need to talk, I said, standing in the doorway. She muted the TV, but didn't look at me. What now? She asked, her tone flat and uninterested. This isn't working, I said simply. I've tried everything I can think of, but it's not enough for you. And honestly, I'm done trying. She turned to me, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought she might argue, but she didn't. Instead, she just stared at me, waiting for me to continue. I've spent weeks beating myself up, trying to figure out how to fix this. But I can't fix something you don't want to fix. If you're unhappy, if you feel like this isn't enough for you, then fine. But I won't keep sacrificing my own peace and self-respect for someone who treats me like this. Her silence was deafening. I had expected anger, some kind of reaction, but she just sat there staring at me with those cold eyes. So what are you saying? She finally asked, her voice calm but devoid of any emotion. I'm saying that I'm not going to keep living like this. If you want to stay married, then we need to fix this together. But if you can't do that, if you're determined to keep punishing me for something I don't even understand, then maybe it's time we go our separate ways. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. For the first time, I wasn't angry or defensive. I was just honest. I'd reached my limit, and she knew it. She didn't respond immediately. She just sat there, her face unreadable. I didn't wait for an answer. I turned and left the room, leaving her to process what I had just said. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly, not because I thought things would magically get better, but because I'd finally stood up for myself. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for certain. I was done being a pawn in her game. From that moment on, I was playing by my own rules. The next morning, the house felt eerily quiet. Not the tense, stifling silence we'd been living in for weeks, but something different, like the calm after a storm. I woke up feeling lighter than I had in months. I didn't know if that weight had lifted because I'd finally said my piece, or because I was prepared to walk away if I had to. Either way, I knew there was no going back to the way things were. When I came downstairs, she was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in her hand, staring out the window. She didn't acknowledge me as I walked in, and I didn't force the issue. I grabbed my own cup and sat down across from her, waiting to see if she'd say anything. For a while, we just sat there, the quiet stretching between us like a canyon. Finally, she broke the silence. "So what happens now?" It was a simple question, but it hit me hard. What had happened now? I had already drawn my line in the sand, but I didn't have a roadmap for what came next. Still, I knew one thing. Whatever the future held, it couldn't look like the mess we'd been living in. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I can't keep living like this." "I won't." She nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on the window. "Do you really mean it about leaving?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel anger or resentment. Just clarity. "Yes," I said. "If this is what our marriage has become, resentment, manipulation, keeping score, then I don't see the point. I want a partner, not an opponent." Her face flickered with something, regret, maybe, or guilt, but she didn't deny what I said. Instead, she sighed and finally looked at me. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad," she said quietly. I felt invisible for so long, like nothing I do matters. And when you started pulling away, I didn't know how to fix it, so I pushed too hard." Her admission caught me off guard. I had expected more defensiveness, another round of blame shifting, but this felt genuine. Still, I wasn't ready to let my guard down completely. "I never wanted you to feel that way," I said carefully. "But the way you handled it, turning our marriage into some kind of transaction, that's not okay. You hurt me, and you made me question everything about us." She nodded, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was no hostility in her expression. "I know," she said, "and I'm sorry. I let my frustration get the better of me, but I don't want to lose you." Her words hung in the air, and I could tell she meant them. But the damage had already been done, and I wasn't sure if an apology was enough to bridge the chasm between us. "I need more than words," I said finally. "If we're going to make this work, things have to change for both of us." She agreed, but even as we talked about what change would look like, more communication, mutual respect, actual effort, I couldn't shake the feeling that it might be too little, too late. I had spent so much time bending over backward, trying to keep things together, and I wasn't sure if I had the energy to keep doing it. Over the next few weeks, we tried. We really did. There were good days, moments where it felt like we might be able to find our way back to each other. But those moments were always fleeting, overshadowed by the lingering resentment and mistrust that had taken root. Every time we had a disagreement, I couldn't help but wonder if she still saw me as a wallet instead of a husband. And every time she looked at me with frustration, I wondered if she regretted staying. Eventually, we had another conversation, a real one, free of accusations and ultimatums. And we both admitted the same thing. We were tired. Tired of fighting, tired of pretending, tired of trying to force something that no longer felt natural. In the end, we decided to part ways, not out of anger or bitterness, but because we both realized that the marriage we once had was gone. And as painful as it was to admit, staying together for the sake of staying together would have only made things worse. Walking away wasn't easy, but it was necessary for both of us. And while I can't say I walked out of that house unscathed, I did walk out with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. I knew who I was, what I deserved, and, most importantly, what I would never settle for again.